Okay, our final speaker of the day, Brent Allan, my dear friend. Brent Allan is the Executive Officer, which sort of means Executive Director in Canada, of Living Positive Victoria in Melbourne, Australia, and has been working in the community response to HIV/AIDS since the 1990s, early 1990s, both in Australia and abroad. And by abroad, he means Canada, because he's originally Canadian, and I first met Brent when he was working at the Canadian AIDS Society about 1993, 1994. So we've been colleagues for a long time, and I'm very happy that he's come here today to talk about really some very significant work going on in Australia. As a gay man living with HIV for the past 16 years, he's been active in efforts to build the capacity of people living with HIV through advocacy, education, and representation, and has been the past vice president of their national organization, National Association of People Living with HIV. And he was convener on this international think tank that we did on gay men's health several years ago. And most recently, he was the local co-chair of the community program for the International AIDS Conference, AIDS 2014. So he's a passionate guy and an advocate for the community, and a really good friend. And please join me in welcoming Brent Allan.
Thanks, everyone. I definitely want to thank Rick and Terry and the organizers for the invitation to speak. And as is my custom, I want to thank people living with HIV, because it's your stories and the lives that we share with researchers and advocates and programmers that makes this work possible. I'd also like to acknowledge at the beginning of this presentation a campaign that's running through the AIDS Council of New South Wales in Sydney called Ending HIV. I particularly love its aspirational intents, a call to action to test often, treat early, and stay safe. I love the fact of its simple nature, that it speaks to multiple audiences and reminds us of the shared goals we have. This presentation, however, is meant to explore how HIV stigma stops all of that from happening. So I'd like to start with a quote from Ban Ki-moon about stigma, and I was really reminded of how ubiquitous stigma is in the field of HIV at the recent AIDS conference. It was hard to go through any session without it being reminded. Clinical sessions, community sessions, you know, in many of the policy and government sessions were articulating, you know, until we can get a handle on stigma and social change that it encompasses, we're not going to get a handle on HIV. The next few slides I'm going to take you through is a little bit of a stigma 101, so bear with me for this. But one of the things I really want to pay homage to is what Dr. Kendall said, which is around positive prevention and the fact that people living with HIV are part of the solution. We are central and we are vital to ensuring a successful response to HIV. So how stigma manifests? There's really 4 types of stigma talked about in the literature. The personal stigma, these are attitudes or beliefs that you have about other people. So for example, HIV positive people are bad, they're failures, they're junkies, they're whores. Perceived stigma, these are the views that other people may have that you share. So I believe that they're whores and junkies and bad people because others believe that. There's the self-stigma, the views you hold of yourself. I'm a bad person because I'm HIV positive. Or the structural stigma, I'm not allowed to be a surgeon. I'm not allowed to be a dentist. I'm not allowed to, and so on. It's interesting, though, some of the themes around stigma and its manifestation are that you can have and display stigma and discrimination against people and not even know you're actually doing it. So it has both an intentional and unintentional effect. It is, however, something that people talk about as feeling uncomfortable, an ill-fitting suit. They know it's maybe wrong, but they can't really talk about why they think it's wrong. And it does often have historical baggage, sweeping generalizations picked up by others without critical thought. impacts of stigma, again, this was talked a bit about by Dr. Kendall, it absolutely reduces testing rates. We know this around the world, it has this effect. It discounts prevention messages by ensuring that other people think, oh, that message is for you, not for me. Oh, that message is for people who have lots of sex, but I don't have lots of sex. So stigma allows you to other people incredibly well. It impairs honest sexual negotiations. Certainly in Canada, I find, you know, unfortunately, your criminalization of HIV positive people quite appalling. And how do you have a sexual honest negotiation when you are afraid of criminal ramifications? The shame, the intense feeling of believing that you're a flawed individual, unworthy of acceptance or belonging, induces chronic self-doubt, silencing, and this constant obsession of keeping your secret. This in turn turns to diminishing your social connectedness, which we know has a profound effect on your mental health and sense of well-being. Diminishes your ability to participate in groups, in services, annihilates any bridge to care you may have. So those who could be looking after you or referring you into programs don't because they can't. And it intensifies a social disadvantage and induces stress of all kinds, both physical and mental. So knowing all of this, even in Australia, where we've been, you know, hallmarked for having this fantastic response to HIV, this is now our 7th national HIV strategy. And stigma has been in all of them since the beginning, since 1989. And it falls under this rubric called the enabling environment, which is really a focus on changing social and legal structures. But in the last few years, there was a response to this, and in 2012, we issued a report on stigma in Australia, and it did 4 things. It measured the experience of stigma amongst people living with HIV, it identified and quantified the factors that contribute to stigma, it explored the relationship between stigma and health, and importantly, identified the factors associated with resilience and social inclusion, and strategies for how to strengthen these. I have to say that, you know, HIV stigma is so concerning to public health officials around the world. 38 countries have produced similar reports. Argentina, Myanmar, Zambia, the list goes on. And although we know stigma is a problem, and we know it has a disabling effect, it's almost as if people don't really know what to do. It just seems so daunting. And so you just kind of hope that it'll change somehow, sometime. So we decided to say enough and take a very visible action about doing something different around HIV stigma. This is an innovative crowd-funded and crowd-sourced campaign. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine over the next few slides the data from the stigma audit with some of the campaign material that has been crowdsourced from the campaign. So on HIV discrimination, over a quarter of people living with HIV in Australia say they've had a less favorable result from their healthcare provider. I find it shocking at 10% in the last 2 years. And over 50% have had their HIV status disclosed without their permission. As Jay says, living with the stigma of HIV is a tougher burden than living with the illness. It's not the impact of the virus that gets under my skin, no pun intended, but the shameful and judgmental mentality that has evolved from my gay brothers that should know better. On living with HIV, 65% of people feel ashamed of living with HIV. 40% believe that most people think that a person with HIV is disgusting. That's that perceived stigma. 40% have been hurt by how people have reacted to learning they have HIV. And over 50% report depression or anxiety. That's double the national average in Australia. As Jim says, I find living with HIV stigma harder than living with the virus itself. It might be an insulting comment heard in a bar, an ignorant media report, or a resounding silence when you tell someone online. The diagnosis only happens once, but HIV stigma rears its ugly head again and again. On relationships and sex, 55% are afraid to tell their sexual partners that they're positive, and 62% believe that someone wouldn't want to have a relationship with them anyway. As Johnny says, I thought I would never find love again. After all, who would seriously hook up with a guy with a serious contagious illness? Then I made a change from within and found richness, resilience, and resolve. I also found love, the best kind of love, the kind of love that comes unhampered by prejudice. On treatments, 40% are said they're concerned being seen even gathering their treatments from a clinic known to dispense HIV medications for fears that people will find out that they're positive. And avoid taking their medications in public. And over 60% are concerned that they'll have physical changes and some of the mythologies that people still carry around early treatments and what might happen to them. So they avoid taking the medications. As an anonymous submission to the ENUF campaign says, I'm not sure I want to know if I'm HIV positive. I see what it's like for guys my age out there if they say they're pos. I reckon it's easier not to know. So this is how the ENUF campaign works. People submit a story online. What we do is we contextualize the story and grab quotes from the story, and it's generated into a campaign. This is all done automatically online. Takes very little effort, and it's crowdsourcing at its fundamental. So what's unique about the campaign? Well, the campaign relies upon people doing something. For the first part, not just sitting back consuming messages, but writing a story, signing a pledge, wearing a t-shirt, wearing a button. The design reduces the costs because it is a completely black and white campaign, but it also focuses attention on the brand, and in turn the brand ENUF becomes the rallying cry. So this in advertising is what we call the hook. So someone, I've got lots of questions about what ENUF stands for. People have asked if it's my Myers-Briggs, and then they look at it and go, that's not a Myers-Briggs. They've asked me, you know, do I have a problem spelling? And that's all you need to start a conversation about something as important as stigma. And that's why we've chosen to make it the way it is. Ironically, because it is crowdsourced, and in Australia, we don't have to get permission for our campaigns. I don't want to give you that impression, but we do need to negotiate the messages with our funders. And because we can't tell our funders what the messages are going to be, because we don't know what the messages are going to be until the story submissions come in, we can't get any government funding for the campaign. Although they're incredibly supportive of the campaign, they just can't give any funding because it's impossible to have a real-time generated campaign if you have to wait to message treat, to take it to the Department of Health, to get them to sign off on it. And you know, I worked in the Department of Health. It takes a long time to sometimes get your staples ordered, let alone getting sign off on a campaign message. And it's incredibly low cost. So the entire campaign, which has been running since 2012, has cost just over $30,000. Incredibly cheap campaign. So what happens to support the ENUF campaign? And we are incredibly opportunistic. We now have about 47 ambassadors all around the world supporting the ENUF campaign, all the way from chief directors in UNAIDS through to she and her husband, they're senators, conservative senators in Australia. We have an ENUF manifesto and an ENUF pledge that you read and you sign up to when you sign up to the campaign online. It's spurned a verbatim theater piece called Status, which I'm negotiating with some theater producers to come to Vancouver, hopefully in 2015 in July, as well as art exhibitions and educational pieces. The ENUF Promotion consists mostly of posters, of those posters that you've seen. There's the website, which you'll see down there, that says the ENUF, and the buttons and t-shirts. Again, very low cost, very high impact. The other thing that I really want to talk about is about resilience, because one of the things we were terribly afraid of when we started this campaign was that it was just going to be a litany of depressing victim stories being submitted, and ironically, it's not at all. Most of the stories follow this kind of three-part formula, although they don't know they're doing it. Most of the stories are, I was afraid of, then I, and now I. And that's how most of the stories travel that we get. So it's actually very easy for us to pick the resilience stories out of it. And I have to say we are purposeful. We do pick the resilience stories out. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes some of the stigma stories are so powerful that we choose those. We have about, so there's been over 100 submissions. There's 60 of them that have been translated into campaign material so far. I thought what I would do, because I have a few more minutes, I think, is I'll show you what's happened. So BMS, Bristol Myers Squibb, loved the campaign so much that they decided to help us with the resilience capacity of the campaign and decided to produce these stories of resilience. I mean so much. Paul's my best friend. Paul's my best friend. You know, not just my partner, not just my husband. So, and we've been through a lot. Like we've been some really bad, some really great patches.
He's a very passionate person. He's extremely ethical, and he's very much motivated by doing the right thing for people around him.
The early days were so bad. They were so bad, and people were so scared, and unfortunately that fear lingers, and the fear has now morphed into not necessarily feeling bad about HIV, but feeling bad for people with HIV, when in fact people with HIV can be remarkable and extraordinary, and that is what's important now. We constantly have projects. It's a constant. We spend a large amount of our time dreaming and scheming, and there's a list of things that we both want to get done.
Making bread, it's one of those things that most people don't do, that used to be a standard part of every household. It's very easy just to go to the supermarket and buy supermarket vegetables, but there's nothing that quite compares with that sense of having grown something yourself, and that is better product and more tasteful and more flavourful, and you have 100% knowledge of what went into it.
Live well. Learn plenty. Laugh often. Love much and expect well.
So the reason I show you that is that all of those, the three that they've done, and there's another set of three, is to demonstrate what we're trying to do around resilience building, and that is to normalize living with HIV in a really profound way. These are, so Jai Wallace is an Olympian. Deanna is a world famous Tough Mudder champion. But it's about normalizing it and showing how you can be resilient and live with HIV. I just want to talk a bit more about resilience because it is an important part of stigma, and we've come up with this way of conceptualizing our programming models on resilience, and we've separated it into 4 quadrants. Solo to group programs, from coping to confidence enabling and leadership development programs. Your point of diagnosis is probably down here in your solo coping area, and that's where you'd probably contact counselors or peer support or buddy programs. Again, moving across that axis. In the group-based area, it's newly diagnosed programs, healthy living programs like stop smoking programs, supportive social programs. We run these programs called Planet Positive, where it's really just about bringing people together GYG, which is our Generation Y Guys program. In the enabling and leadership area, again, solo, sort of one-on-one, from mentoring to coaching, and we're setting up programs where our mentors become coaches. And then finally, in a group sort of area, Speakers Bureau, where we do high-intensity training with them, you know, as far as even media training, how to speak to the media. And then leadership development program. We've recently signed up with the OAN and the Pacific AIDS Network to offer the Positive Leadership Development Institute in Australia, going incredibly well, and doing great work in terms of leadership. We've had to tweak some of the stuff because culturally it didn't really work in Australia, and condense it because they move a lot faster there. The also thing about, in closing, I'd really like to contend that whilst responding to HIV stigma is vital through education, campaigns, and contact, so too is the challenge of building resilience, to be out, open, and vocal in our communities. And resilience embodies the personal qualities that enable one to thrive in the face of adversity, and describes a process where people bounce back from adversity and go on with their lives. Building resilience is not unique to the issue of combating HIV stigma. In fact, it's a proven strategy from everything from schoolyard bullying through to resilience training, very popular in the US military, to address and prevent post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's three key things that we say are important in resilience skills development, and that's ability to create and sustain networks, which includes understanding how and who to access for support when needed. I tend to like to call this the shock absorbers in your life. The second is practicing reflective practice or mindfulness, where you're able to see through the stigmatizing behavior you may be subject to, and to identify the causes and drivers, and appreciate that, in fact, often the stigma has far less to do with you than it has to do from the source you're receiving it from. And finally, building adaptive capacity. This is the capacity to bounce back, to not take heart from perceived slights, and to be resilient. I often use the metaphor of those stress balls. You know, you get punched, but you bounce back. And that's resilience. I would like to contend that that resilience is in fact the opposite side of the coin of stigma, and our work to challenge stigma is social change, closely linked to how people feel about marginalized populations and vulnerable behaviors. Our investment is not a single campaign, and so the ENUF campaign isn't going to solve this, but it is continued diligence, underpinned by the values of respect, fairness, and equity. By developing a set of skills and characteristics that offer resilience in a face of stigma and other setbacks in life, I believe we enable people with HIV to fully participate in civil society and to not be victims of a virus nor the stigma that surrounds it. And I encourage you all to go to the ENUF campaign site, to consider the pledge, sign up, contribute a story. It is an international campaign, and certainly I understand that there are some Canadian groups who are interested in setting up a Canadian arm as well as in New Zealand. So thanks.